Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology, joined by Pat Flynn, and we are going to be talking about his new book that just came out, The Best Argument from God with Sophia. Pat, welcome back to the show. How you been, man?
Good, man. It's always great to see you. Life has been crazy busy, crazy busy, but all good busy. And it's always nice to be on the Reason and Theology Show. Thank you.
Oh, I'm always honored to have you on. I learn every single time you come on. You're the man when it comes to philosophy, so I'm always excited to have you on to talk about anything philosophically related.
Cool, man. Yeah, well, happy to be here, and thanks for bringing a little attention to this new book of mine as well. I appreciate it. Yeah.
By the way, I have to ask: Is that Krang? From,
Dude, it's Krang.
For the Ninja Turtles.
Of course, it's Krang. Who else would it be?
It said, what does it say? The Rage of
Krang, man. Yeah, of
awesome.
course.
Okay,
yeah, one of my favorite villains of all time. Yeah.
Did you ever see the Ninja Turtles movie where Crane was in it? It's kind of like
I know the one. It was like the fairly more recent one, right?
Yeah,
I didn't. Yeah. I did not, because I heard they weren't particularly good. But then again, I guess the original 90s one that I love so much was kind of critically panned too, but I thought it was one of the why they even kept making movies after that is beyond me. Clearly the peak has been reached, right?
That's true. That's true. Anyways. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about your book. I mean, first of all, tell me a little bit about how this book distinguishes itself from others when it comes to arguments for God.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks. It's I'll start with a little bit of background of what inspired this book. So it's called The Best Argument for God. And it's and that's sort of in response to what I probably consider the best argument against God. And here we can go right to Aquinas, who in his Summa, as many of your gentle listeners will be aware of, when he's considering the existence of God, he only really considers 2 objections, which is interesting because Aquinas is usually like, hey, here's 47 objections to this thing I'm going to, try and argue for, and then goes through them. But for God, he's kind of just got 2 in mind.
Okay.
And the first one is the problem of evil, which we're all familiar with. And we might talk about that a little bit later on. And it is something I talk about in the book as well. In the final chapter of the book, I have I think a pretty detailed theodicy and some ways of trying to navigate through the problem of evil that I do think are fairly novel, actually. But it's the second objection that Aquinas takes up that really inspired me to write this book. And that is essentially something like this, Michael. It's, hey, the principles of nature are enough, right? Like we've got all the explanatory juice we need just from the principles of nature to make sense of everything. We don't need God. Right, as any sort of explanation, an unnecessary hypothesis. He doesn't frame it exactly like that, but that's essentially what he's up to. And the reason that interested me is because, for people who don't know, I used to, I would have fallen into the camp of a naturalist. That's sort of where, I spent many years in my philosophical formation. And then eventually, for various reasons, some of which we'll get into, that paradigm just didn't seem to be able to explain everything that I think needed to be explained. And then I found classical theism, and it seemed to do the job for me. So not only do I have a personal history with thinking that something like that objection was true, but I think there's many smart, sophisticated atheists that's sort of their objection, and they might and it might be presented in contemporary form, kind of like this. And they might say something like, "Hey, if 2 theories explain just as much, then you should believe the simpler theory," right? And then they'll say, well, theism and naturalism, and by naturalism I mean just a sort of philosophically developed form of atheism, right? Theism and atheism, they explain just as much, right? They're on an explanatory par, let's say. But naturalism is simpler. So let's believe naturalism. And I always found that to be a very interesting argument, one that's worth taking seriously. So the whole project of the book, the thesis of the book is really not just to try and break that argument, but to reverse it. And what I'm arguing is effectively this, that naturalism can only explain some, but not all, of what classical theism can when strapped with far more complexity. And then what the book does is it just tries to go through some, but not all, of what I think those sort of large-scale features of reality are, that any worldview or philosophical paradigm has to be able to make sense of, from contingency to consciousness and rationality and stuff like that. And it just tries to make the case that, like in the more modest instances, that theism offers a better, simpler explanation. But sometimes I'm a little bit more aggressive and I say, in fact, the only conceivable explanation here is a classical theistic one. So the book is, in many senses, a cumulative case. And it also blends methodology, which I think some of your listeners might be interested in. So for people who are into philosophical arguments for God and natural theology, there's kind of there's more than two approaches, but there's two that are pretty prominent. One is the kind of old school approach, right, where you take some philosopher like an Aristotle or even Aquinas, and they're a metaphysician out in the field, if you will, and they're just kind of carving reality at its joints, right, classifying things, trying to make sense of the intelligible structure of nature, right? And then what they'll say is like, hey, there's all these sorts of things here. There's composite things and there's changing things. And upon a deep, sustained philosophical analysis, it's going to be the case that the necessary condition for any of these things is something that sort of transcends all these categories, right? That the composite points to the simple, that the changing points to the immutable, that the contingent points to the necessary. And when we think about what that sort of thing is, that's sort of the anchor or foundation of all reality, it turns out when we think really hard and deep about that, it actually kind of spills out all these divine attributes, if you will. You know, not just the ones that I mentioned of simplicity and immutability, but they'll make arguments for omnipotence and omniscience and pure goodness and stuff like that, or that come kind of packaged in a wider metaphysical framework. Call that the metaphysical demonstration approach. In the first section of my book, I kind of give a contemporary cosmological contingency argument where I'm borrowing traditional insights from Aquinas and Aristotle, but also bringing in contemporary thinkers as well to try and do that sort of thing, right? And I'm focusing on I'm sorry, am I rambling on too much? Because I realize
no, this is helpful.
Probably answered your question. Like
I do have a few follow-up questions though when you're done, but no, please continue.
Yeah. Interject at any point. So that's so I focus on kind of two features of reality, contingency and metaphysical compositeness. And I argue that for a certain explanatory principle that sort of wraps around all these things, and say that in order to make sense of why there's any metaphysically composite or contingent things at all, we do need that simple necessary reality. And then I give arguments to argue for why that's going to turn out to be the God of classical theism, right? And we can get into details of that if we want to. But then what I do is I kind of shift methodology. I say, okay, whether you think what I just made was a totally sound argument or just gives you some weight in the scale, right? It at least gives us a working worldview hypothesis now, right? We've got something that's pretty well shaped of like what we think is the kind of basement of reality as a theist. Now, how well does this predict or explain other features of reality compared to a naturalistic hypothesis? And then, so then I kind of shift methodology, and this goes into the other way that philosophers argue for God, which is a sort of worldview comparison approach, right? Where you'll just argue that a particular worldview has greater explanatory comprehensiveness. It's better confirmed by these features of reality than another one. And perhaps it has other theoretical virtues as well. The big one being simplicity, which is a very complicated debate in itself. I have a whole chapter in my book called Simplicity. It's complicated because it is trying to think through that stuff. So I try to do that. And then really what I'm doing there, Michael, is I'm just showing, I'm trying to accomplish a couple of things. One is I'm trying to give people like a little tour through the different areas of philosophy. So like we go into philosophy of mind and we think about consciousness and semantic content and rationality and like, what is it that we're trying to explain? And like, what are the naturalistic proposals? What is a theistic proposal? Why do I think the theistic one is better and ultimately simpler? Morality. So we kind of go into ethical theory or meta ethics, right? And I kind of, try to make the case for theism there. Order and stability, both in a very broad sense, but then I also do focus a bit on the fine-tuning debate and stuff like that. And this is where I'm kind of building that greater cumulative case and saying, hey, we're getting a lot of confirmatory support in terms of classical theism, because I argue that with some very plausible assumptions that this is just the sort of world that we would expect if classical theism is true, right? From conscious beings, order, rationality, and ultimately, I even make the case for suffering and evil. And I say, and I argue that naturalism, unless you really complicate it and specify it, is not anywhere nearly as predictively successful. And in some cases, it can't explain the relevant data points at all. So how is it different than any other book out there? Well, I kind of just summarized what the whole book is about. So if people have read other books, they can probably quickly tell whether that's different or not. Yeah, but I think it is, if only because it blends methodologies. It's sort of a synthesis of different approaches. And I don't rest my case on any one particular argument, right? I think, even though I think there are just like certain knockdown arguments, just that in my experience, a philosophical case, if you're trying to convince somebody, it's always best through a series of converging, considerations and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. The more arguments that you have on your side, the better.
One would think.
But you would argue that the position that you demonstrate and present versus the naturalist has more explanatory power.
Yes.
And accounts for the data better. Okay, that's helpful. Now, you mentioned earlier an assumption that some people have, and that is, well, if there's two theories out there that both account for or explain the evidence or the data, you go with the one that's less complex, that asserts less. Right. But is that necessarily something that we should accept? I mean, might it be the case that sometimes things are a little bit more complex and the truth is with the more complex theory?
Yeah, and well, we have real world examples of that, my friend, right? It's not the case that the simplest thing is always true. Right. And I don't think people who have really thought about that will demand that. They'll usually be more modest. So they'll say simplicity is a general guide to truth, right? But we should talk about this a little bit, because at least on the popular level, people are always like, Occam's razor, right? But and like, okay, fair enough. Don't multiply the entities beyond what's necessary to explain something. Sure, but why? Why the hell not, right? Maybe I just like multiplying entities for the sake of it, right? What's wrong with that, right? So like, why? If simplicity is a guide to truth, well, why? And then not only that, but like, in what sense, right? Where does simplicity matter most? And in my book, I argue it actually matters most on the fundamental level, right? Like at the root, at the very bottom of a worldview theory. Like, it doesn't matter how much stuff you have kind of floating above. What matters most is how simple is that kind of root, core, fundamental aspect, right? And so we can get into all that if we want, but returning to the original point, why would simplicity be a guide to truth? And I'll give you I make the case more substantially in the book, but I'll give you what I think is the short answer. And I think it ultimately has to do with a matter of probability. So this is sometimes best brought out by giving some stock examples, right? So, and it'll show kind of how common sense our intuitions around simpler theories are. So say I go out front and I notice that my driveway is wet, right? So there's something that needs to be explained. Well, why is my driveway wet, right? Well, here's a theory. My sprinkler turned on, right? Here's another theory. It rained. Here's another theory. 20 birds all flew by and all spit at once, and 17 kids came with buckets of water and on my driveway, right? Okay, so now we have some competing hypotheses, right? The sprinkler explains the data well. The rain theory doesn't really, because just my driveway is wet. So there's something. So I kind of so that shows us that explanatory comprehensiveness matters more than simplicity. Like, I'm going to more quickly put the rain theory away because it doesn't wrap around the data in the best way that even the weird bird theory does, right? Because it's not restricted enough, right? I would expect all the neighborhood to be wet if it rained, not just the driveway, unless you complicate the rain hypothesis and say, like, maybe it was a little cloud or something like that, right? So then we got the sprinkler and the bird theory. Why am I almost certain that the sprinkler theory is more likely to be true? Well, ultimately, I think it has to come down to a matter of probability and the number of moving parts, right, or basic components a theory has. And I think we can see this pretty intuitively, that the more kind of basic components and moving parts a theory has, then the more ways that theory could turn out to be false, right? And the more ways that theory could turn out to be false is the less likely it is to be true. So it's just a matter of probability. And this makes sense, right? That other things equal, probably the simpler theory has more going for it, but not absolutely. Because as we know in real world examples, sometimes things are just a little bit more complicated.
Sure.
But I think that that's one of the reasons of why, other things equal, if we're going to place a bet, right, we should place the bet on the simpler theory, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So it's a general principle, but it's not always
a guiding, but not infallible rule. Right? Yeah.
But would you argue that the naturalist view actually requires more information, or
More information to describe, and in that sense, is
yeah,
maybe a more complicated theory. Sure.
yeah. Do you think it's more complex? Because the assumption that some are going to make is it's less complex, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The theistic view is you're adding one more thing. God is the explanation to these things, whereas the naturalist has one less thing. Well, no, I don't believe that God is the explanation, but rather, would you say that actually it's the naturalist perspective that is more complex?
Yeah, I would, because it's not just having number of things that matters to a theory, right? And this is one of the aspects I delve into in my book, because it might be right that in our ontology, right, the theist has one more thing, maybe, right, than the naturalist. I would argue we actually have a lot more things, and thank God for it, because it's a lot more magnificent. I'm not just committed to God, but archons and angels and all of it. Bring it all on, baby. Right?
There's additional things. Sure.
Yeah. And I would argue there's other just metaphysical commitments that a classical theist has that naturalists don't, but they're required to make sense of reality, right? But here's the important part. Depending on what your fundamental theory is, it's going to kind of cause you to see everything kind of extending from it in a different way, right? And now this is where it gets complicated in my book. But ultimately, what I argue for is, by theism having a simpler root theory, simpler at the bottom, you not only have greater theoretical and ontological simplicity. So there's different categories of simplicity at the bottom, where theism, you have a simple root of a being of pure absolute perfection, right? That then predicts this great chain or hierarchy of being above it. You also have an extremely unified theory as well. And that's important. The problem is, if you're a naturalist and you just start with a simple principle of indifference, right? Naturalists start with this principle of indifference. What do you expect from a principle of indifference? The answer, of being honest, is not much. So now we have to start specifying, right? Now we have to, and then what theism could have predicted before concerning this material universe and all the laws and stuff like that, those kind of now sink to the fundamental level for the naturalist. And those are very complicated specifications. And they're also very arbitrary specifications, whatever the basic sort of laws and parameters and whatever you think is fundamental as a naturalist, right? So yeah, you dropped off God. But now what sank to your root, if you're going to get any sort of predictive success from it, is now a very complicated, highly specified, arbitrarily complex theory. And that's the sort of stuff that I argue is disqualifying, right? Is on that root fundamental level. But even that isn't going to be enough generally for the naturalist to have to explain sort of everything else that I argue in the book, right? So they're going to have to start, whether it's the moral dimension or the rational dimension or the conscious dimension, right? They're going to have to start kind of putting in more components to the theory, adding adjunct hypotheses, right? And then that's going to further require more information to explain, and it's going to further keep complicating the hypothesis. And furthermore, it's not just that the naturalist is saying, theist, you've got A and B, the world and God. I've just got B, and that's it. No, you've got B and not A, right? And there's no general rules of probability theory that says B and not A is any simpler than A and B as well, right? So that's the naturalist, to exclude theism, which they must, if you're going to be a naturalist, has to, at the root of the theory, have something that excludes God, right? That is not there as well. One more thing to kind of drive home that these simplicity debates are nowhere near as simple as the person who says, well, you've just got one extra thing, right? Like, once you actually contemplate the specifics, I think it shifts significantly in favor of theism in terms of the most relevant aspects of simplicity. And again, this is going to depend on the naturalistic theory. And I try to be very careful in the book of showing the different ranges of options and showing, well, no matter which way you're going to go, you're going to either run into this problem or that problem. So I understand if I don't mention one here, trust me, it's probably in the book or something covers it in the book. But just to give one example, right? If the naturalist wants to say, let me give a crude example, right? Maybe not many naturalists say that, but some might say, okay, even as a theist, right, you've got contingent realities, but then you've got this necessary reality. It's another thing, right? Okay. I'm a naturalist. I'm just going to say everything's contingent, right? The universe is just there. It's a brute fact. It's contingent. Now, I only got contingent realities, right? Well, now but then the theist can say, well, hold on, but you've also got another category now, right? Because even though I have all contingent realities, I have all contingency ultimately grounded in necessity. I only have grounded or cause contingent realities. You now have maybe some grounded and cause contingent realities, but now you also have ungrounded and uncaused contingent realities, right? That's a whole new sort of thing, right? That invites all sorts of other problems, including things that should be explained that are not explained, right? So not only have you lost the explanatory target, just conceded that I've got no explanation for contingent realities, right? So that's a huge strike. But now I would argue you do have a new type of thing, uncaused or ungrounded contingent realities, that is itself another cost, right? So matters are just more complicated than they initially seem when it comes to these types of debates, right? And you could see the general strategy I took there and how that could be mirrored in other respects, depending on how people want to go with it, right?
Now, but you would also have an additional category, a non-contingent, self-explanatory category or being too, right?
Yes.
So at the end of the day, considering that, do you have just as many categories as the naturalist, or would you say that they have more? And does that even matter?
Yeah, I don't think that argues as much. At the end of the chapter on simplicity, I argue, because again, I'm trying to be fair, on some areas where I think the naturalists might have a simplicity advantage, but I'll say that it nowhere makes up for where they have the disadvantages.
Okay.
Right? So there might be some ideological, I won't get into that now, stuff like that. And I give some plausible responses where the theist can say, actually, the naturalist has those two, like analogical predication and stretch concepts, stuff like that. A little complicated, but I would say this, right? You mentioned the idea that, and this relates to explanatory comprehensiveness. And this is really important because whatever else we want to say about simplicity, it is a secondary consideration, right? Okay. If you're lacking in explanatory power, then simplicity considerations are really, like, simplicity is really just a tiebreaker, right? That's it, right? If you've got things that are sort of equal in their explanatory comprehensiveness, then you can consider simplicity.
Okay.
But if you've got a theory, like, here's a really simple theory, Michael. Nothing exists. Nothing. There's your theory, right? That's about as simple as it could possibly get.
That's true,
right.
But it has no explanatory
power. But like,
power.
what the hell is that, right? Nobody believes that, right? Well, it's so simple. Isn't
I don't know.
amazing,
Maybe some people do.
Isn't it awesome, right? It's so simple, but nobody believes it because it's nonsense.
So there
might
be some
explain
people
anything. Yeah, no, believe me, there's some people, right? There's some people out there, and like at that point, I don't have a philosophical argument. I have maybe a recommendation for a medication, but that's it, right?
Yeah.
But that's very.
There's nothing you could do at that point when a person tries to pull that card.
Right. Yeah. I get it. Philosophers, like, we're supposed to be patient and entertain anything, but like, you got to draw the line somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I'm sorry, man. I don't know what to do with that.
I can't help you.
Yeah.
So you're saying at the end of the day, though, they have less explanatory power, even if they have more simplicity. So
what I do argue, especially in the first section of the book, and I reiterate this later, is that, like, what we really need, right, at the sort of bottom of reality, is something that can explain everything else and yet also explain itself.
Okay.
And that's like kind of a crazy thing to think about. So when we think of explanations, we think of something that sort of renders something intelligible and removes mystery. And a lot of causes we think serve as explanations, but not all explanations need to be causal. You know, why don't square circles exist? Well, because it's contradictory, and contradictions are impossible. That's an explanation, but it's not a causal explanation, right? And so I say what we're kind of looking for in the hunt for ultimate intelligibility is something that could explain everything else, but that would itself be completely intrinsically intelligible. It's something that, like, if we could grasp its essence, like, it would be immediately clear to us why this thing exists and why it could not exist, right? Its necessary existence, right? It would have to be something like what comes out of the ontological argument, you know, where, like, God carries the reason for his existence intrinsic to himself. And so I don't advance an ontological argument in the book, but I say that the cosmological argument gives us reason to think that there is a sound ontological argument. And what the ontological argument gives us is what would be that, call it not a brute fact, but autonomous fact. Something that if we could grasp the essence of God, because I'm arguing that only the God of classical theism could satisfy this, it would be clear to us why God exists and cannot not exist and is free and all that stuff, right? In the same sense that, like, once we grasp the concept of, like, mountain and valley, we understand that wherever there's a mountain, there's a valley, right? That is the idea of an autonomous fact, something that is completely intrinsically intelligible, that just from within itself, it could answer every coherent question about itself. Now, I say, look, we're obviously not in a position where we can grasp the essence of God, right? But to sort of terminate the hunt of ultimate intelligibility, right, for reality not to be absurd, for there to really be a coherent answer to every coherent question, this is the sort of theoretical entity that and it's the only sort of theoretical entity, right? That can like be in that spot, right? And this is sort of what I'm doing through the cosmological argument. There's reasons to think that this thing actually exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is that I think that these certain explanatory principles are true. I develop a certain form of the PSR, although I also take a path that doesn't rely on PSR. And also say that if something is going to be completely intrinsically intelligible, that it could be this autonomous fact that sort of punctuates reality, right? It's going to have to be like categorically different, right? And this is where I go through this sort of clearing away or apophatic theology that you see so much in the tradition, that there's these certain categories or aspects of reality that clearly are not the sort of thing that could be completely intelligible, right? Beings that are brought into existence, contingent beings, finite beings, composite beings, changing beings. All these things are the sorts of things that are always pointing beyond themselves to make sense of why they are at all and why they have the features and characters as they do. So whatever this autonomous fact is, right, it can't be any of these things, right? Yeah. And then like once you start shaving all that junk away, it's not junk, it's good stuff. Once you shave it all away, you really just got classical theism, right? You have this entity that is absolutely simple, incomposite, pure actuality, qualitatively unrestricted, right? Now, like, what is that thing? I don't know. I don't have my mind around it, but I've given you arguments of why that thing has to be there as a necessary condition for everything else. And it seems to be the sort of thing that could be, if anything could be, that autonomous fact that could secure the ultimate intelligibility of reality. Did any of that make sense, Michael?
Yeah, and by the way, I have a follow-up question to something you said here, but it's a little bit of a rabbit trail. You said incomposite, right? So lacking complexity, that is simple. And some people are just going to say, but wait, why is that? Why can't you have this ultimate principle that is complex in nature? Now, I know one of the responses is going to be, well, you're going to have something that holds them together, puts them together, or something like that. But why is that the case?
Yeah. Maybe. So I focus, when it comes to compositeness, on metaphysical compositeness, although I do argue that any composite thing ultimately requires a cause. But I'm interested in the composite level between essence and existence, which is Aquinas', right? This is a very technical part of the book. And in fact, a large section of this book, let me mention for your listeners who are interested, a large section of this book actually got cut because it was too technical. However, for anybody who wants it and orders the book, I'm offering this as a bonus. So if you want to go deeper down this route, you can have this sort of bonus material. And it's developing what I think is a brilliant insight from Aquinas that is later developed by later Thomistic thinkers like Barry Miller. And it comes down to this, that if Aquinas' theory of existence is true, let's just say that we've motivated that, right? That existence is something that is, predicated of concrete individuals, right? Then we quickly get into a certain paradox, right? So take a little bunny rabbit, call him Thumper, right? And Thumper is a metaphysical composite of rabbit essence and an active existence that actually makes Thumper present in reality, right? All right, so we've got this complex, this metaphysical complex, right? And then we can ask, okay, which of these components, metaphysical components, sort of has priority? And this is where you start to kind of be able to generate not just a paradox, but I think a certain contradiction. There's a lot of steps involved and more details in the bonus content if people want it. But the short of the story is this, is that the problem is that Thumper's existence depends upon Thumper's essence for its completion or individuation. And the reason that is it's the existence of Thumper, right? And not some other rabbit. So it seems like the existence element crucially requires the essence element for called its individuation or completion or what have it to be the existence of Thumper, this rabbit, right? However, apart from his existence, Thumper is literally nothing. And in virtue of having nothing, has no abilities to do anything, including individuate or complete his existence. So we have something where we previously argued, or at least assumed, that we have parts of this metaphysical complex that is Thumper, yet neither of the parts in virtue of themselves or the complex as a whole has the capacity to actually be parts, right? So we have something where these must be parts, but considered just in itself, none of these can actually be parts, right?
Does that mean that the distinction between these parts is just merely conceptual?
Well, I argue for a real distinction, right? And
Okay.
that's a different argument. So I'm saying let's
Okay.
just say
Okay.
we already have
Okay.
Aquinas' theory of existence in place, which is a theory of the real distinction, right? That these are
Mhm.
not, that this is a distinction that is extra linguistic, extra
Mhm.
conceptual, right? It's
Mhm.
rooted
Mhm.
in the thing itself. So assuming
Right.
I'm assuming that's in place, right?
Yeah.
And if so, you get this paradox where Thumper would have to somehow like pre-exist his existence to exist, right?
Mhm.
So what I argue is if this is right, and I argue that this is the right analysis of the matter, right? Then what you need is something else to fulfill that capacity. Something else in virtue of which can sort of fund the unity of those constituents of the essence that can impart existence into Thumper essence. Otherwise, you get a contradictory structure. So the argument itself, when you really spell it out, and I think this is a very powerful argument, it's most fully developed by Barry Miller, and his work is hard to find, but he's got a book From Existence to God, and I kind of add my own spin and a few different touches to it. But his argument is that, look, either Thumper is an impossible existent, or Thumper is caused to exist for as long as he exists by some extrinsic entity, whatever that is, right? Now, the cool thing about Miller's argument is not only do you have a very strong reason of why any metaphysical composite has a cause, right? Because otherwise it couldn't exist. It would be a contradictory structure. So we're not even using PSR or anything here, right? We're just running a deep metaphysical analysis and showing unless Thumper exists, and this is important, unless Thumper exists is a suppressed or elliptical proposition, it's a shorthand proposition, then it is a contradictory structure. Thumper could not exist. However, Thumper does exist, so it must be a suppressed proposition. For what? What is it suppressed for? Something like Thumper exists qua dependent on X, whatever X is, right? That Thumper is a caused entity through and through. Like what it is to be Thumper is just to be a caused substance, something like that. So that is the route from composition that I take. And I think it's easiest to see, and I think it's most relevant and profound when you focus on the composition between essence and existence. There's other people who make arguments from other layers of composition. But I think once you really focus on that compositional analysis, you get a lot of cool things from it. One is I think you get a really powerful argument that ultimately, again, you're going to need a being that's absolutely simple, whose essence just is its existence, right? That can ultimately fund the unity of any metaphysical composite. But here's the other cool thing about Aquinas' theory is it actually gives like a good theory of contingency itself. And I make this point in the book, like, why are things contingent? Well, Aquinas' theory has a good answer for that. They're contingent because they're metaphysically composite. Their essence does not guarantee or entail or is identical to their existence, right?
Yeah.
Existence is like these constituents have to have their unity funded. And that's a neat result, right? We see convergence here. And that's what a lot of this book is about, is saying like, look, we can get some really cool converging results, which should increase your confidence that we're kind of on the right path here. Right.
You're saying because their essence does not explain their existence. There's nothing in their essence that necessitates that they exist. So there has to be something that would guarantee their existence. Is that what you're saying?
That's the short of it, right? And for those wondering, yes, I do give arguments for the real distinction and stuff in the book. Some traditional Thomistic ones, like the multiplicity argument and stuff like that, and others, some more contemporary as well. Yeah.
I've always found those fascinating, and they kind of touch on some debates that take place with the Eastern Orthodox on whether or not there can be metaphysical complexity in God. You would argue there cannot be, correct?
No, and I don't think you need to posit it. I'm not an expert on the essence energies debate. I actually just read a recent article from it on Mark Spencer by Dr. Mark Spencer. Very smart guy. He's been on my show a number of times, and he argues that I guess under a certain interpretation, again, I'm not an expert, it's compatible with the Thomistic account. And I think he gives a plausible, model, which that is the case. I don't know if Eastern Orthodox or people who follow Palamas would agree with it. So there are Thomists who think that there is a friendliness that can be had there.
Yeah.
But I, without getting into, again, the details, I would just say that I think that some of the issues that Dr. Spencer is dealing with can be resolved in other easier ways without having to concede any ground, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's helpful to know.
Yeah. Like, for example, God's, one of the issues that comes up with classical theism is, and this is a general issue, right, Michael, is like, how do you get contingency from necessity? How is it that necessity doesn't spill over? right? Especially from a being that's purely actual. How do you get God willing, loving, knowing a contingent creation without putting a metaphysical accident in God? I think the simple answer for that is that all the change is extrinsic to God. You take an extrinsic model, that God remains intrinsically the same across all possible worlds, and that God sort of willing, loving, or knowing creation. The only difference on the ontological scene is just creation coming about with a causal dependence on God.
But if he wills and loves creation, and that change isn't in God, then he's always willed and loved creation. Would that then make creation necessary?
Well, that's part of the fear, right? So what they're what the objectors try to do is they're trying to break some commitment of classical theism, right? Yeah. Either nothing changes in God, so he's sort of always just, willed and loved creation, and in sense creation is not contingent, it's necessary, or it's like contingently necessary, like it's still causally dependent, but like it's always like it could not have been otherwise, right? It's modally contingent, even if not dependently contingent, right? I'm sorry, it is not modally contingent, but it is dependently contingent. That's what I meant to say, right? But that's not what most of us want to say. We want to say that no, it really could have been otherwise. God did not have to create at all, right? Okay, and then they're going to say, well, okay, if God brings about the world, then something has to change in God. And what the classical theist should say is no, nothing needs to change in God, right? Once you have your metaphysics, of knowledge and loving and willing, you can push all contingency extrinsic to God, that God can remain completely intrinsically the same across all possible worlds, if you want to use that language, and that God willing, intending, loving, knowing creation requires nothing more than creation coming about with a causal dependence relation on God ontologically. And if people want a sort of defense of that account, an accessible one, you can see my conversations I've had with Dr. Matthews Grant and Dr. Timothy Paul on my show, Philosophy of the People. If you want a really good book-length defense of something like this, then I recommend Dr. Matthew Grant's, I think it's God's Universal Causality and Libertarian Freedom is the title of it.
So let's shift gears here a little bit from contingency to the problem of suffering and evil that you address in the book.
Yeah.
I've always found this to be a relatively strong argument against theism. And you also mentioned that Aquinas doesn't really deal with a whole lot of objections against theism initially, but one of them that he does engage is the problem of evil, because it's a pretty decent argument. So how do you tackle this in this work?
Yeah, well, yeah. All right, let me do this. Let me outline maybe a couple different ways that one could think about it, and then I'll start to explain how I do it in the book. It's been a while since I read my book, so hopefully I'll remember.
I know how that goes.
You know how it is. Like, I should have refreshed on my own work. Before, you know how it is. Like, you write something, and then it's like, first off, like when I wrote that is one thing, and then it's got to get published. Like, it's been a long time since I looked at this,
absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, gotta dust some of the stuff off here, right? And then, of course, I'll go look at it afterwards. Like, dang it, I forgot all that good stuff, right? Yeah. Be gracious, people, right? Yeah. And no, I want to be very respectful. This is a serious issue. We all deal with suffering, people, right? This is man, it hits us philosophically, it hits us spiritually, it just hits us from every angle, right? So it's a very serious thing to think about. Ultimately, I don't think it's a good objection against God, and ultimately, as crazy as it sounds, I think it actually that the sort of the distribution lines of suffering in this world are confirmatory of God's existence. And it'll take me a little bit to get into that. But let me just give some general strategies for how you can respond to the problem of evil. I don't always endorse all of these. I don't use all of them, but I found, Michael, that it's very helpful if you just kind of show people a range of options and then let them explore, right? One strategy is this. This is Brian Davis likes this strategy, and he calls it the "we know God exists" strategy. And this is kind of like the quick, cheap, and easy way. And some people find this perfectly adequate. Other people think it's like the worst thing ever. And it's just this. It's like, say like, hey, we have really good reasons to think that God exists, whatever those are, cosmological arguments or everything else, right? And we have really good reasons to think that, suffering and evil is real. If two things are actual, they must be compatible. I don't know how it all fits together, but I have reasons for thinking these two things must fit together. So at worst, what we have is a mystery. We have a puzzle, but we don't have a contradiction. And that's it, right? And then you could just insist that no philosopher has been able to tease out a contradiction to the problem, like the strong form problem. And I think that's fairly easy case to make. I think most even skeptical philosophers would say that the strong form, kind of deductive logical problem of evil has largely been set into the philosophical dustbin. A lot of the conversation has gone towards this evidential problem of evil, right? Of where philosophers will say, okay, maybe the suffering and pain of this world doesn't like definitively refute God. But what the skeptic will say is that it's evidence against God to whatever degree. And some will say it's a very high degree or whatever. And there are atheist philosophers who really are not impressed with the problem of evil at all. They don't think it's very good. So there's a range of options there. So that's Davis's response. Yep. I'm sorry, that is not all of his response. He's got an entire book on the problem of evil, and he also wants to argue that God is not a moral agent. So even trying to run the problem of evil just involves a giant category mistake. I do not take that approach. I actually have disagreements with a fair amount of that. I'm trying to decide if I want to get into that now or just kind of set that aside.
That God is a moral agent.
Yeah. So I think the idea, a lot of what Davis says is right, and that God is not a moral agent in exactly the way that we are moral agents, right? And that's because God is not.
Yeah.
You know, if you're coming from a sort of virtue ethic, natural law perspective, a lot of what concerns the moral realm, for example, is what concerns human nature. Right? What is good for us? What are moral obligations? Or it kind of flows from human nature and you know, virtues as perfections of our powers and stuff like that. And clearly God, incarnation aside, is not a human being. So like those things just aren't going to apply to God, right? Whatever else God's goodness is and holiness is, it's not like God is like the most excellent gentleman or lady or something like that.
Yeah.
And so like, that's definitely right. That's definitely right. But I think that sometimes people who take that approach want to go a little bit too far. And I agree that if that's what you mean when you say that God is not a moral agent, I agree. He's not a moral agent just like us. But if you want to keep going further and say that we can have no moral expectations of God whatsoever, I think that's totally false.
Yeah.
And I think it's not consistent with Aquinas. Aquinas thinks we can have expectations of God. One's very simple. Aquinas thinks that if God is going to create, then because God is perfectly rational and good, he's not going to just randomly blip creation out of existence, right? 5 seconds from now. That is an expectation of God. Now, you can argue that expectation is more rooted in God's wisdom and rationality, but so be it, right? It doesn't matter. There's still things we can know about God where we're not completely in the dark that can give us broad, maybe not hyper-specific, but broad expectations about the types of thing God would do or would not do. And this is important for me, and it's important for theists because you kind of got to pick and choose, right? So let me just put something on the table for theists, right? Okay. If you go with me, and you think that you can have broad expectations of God, this is going to, I guess, help you but hurt you, right? It's going to help you because you can tease out some of those expectations to show how theism predicts a world like ours in terms of beings like us and a material world and the great higher chain of being and fine-tuning. And you can get all these predictive scores if you say, hey, from the notion of classical theism, we can get a positive probability of a world like us because we actually do have expectations of God. And we get those expectations not just from contemplating the nature of classical theism, but from other traditional philosophical principles as well, like good being naturally self-diffusive. Norris Clark has a beautiful way, and I detail this in the book, that like God doesn't have to do anything to make himself more perfect. He is the fullness of goodness. But there's, ways of enjoying, there's really 2 ways of enjoying one's own goodness. You can just rest in it, or you can share it. And it's from this impulse to share comes the probability that God will create, right? But that's an expectation of God. And I think Norris Clark is right from that, just putting traditional metaphysical principles to use. That said, as soon as you say that you can get certain expectations of God, now you really have to give a response to the problem of evil. You can't go with Brian Davis anymore. However, if you go like really skeptical theist, and I don't know if Davis would classify himself as a skeptical theist, but if you go with skeptical theist and you say like, I just really don't know what God would do, then you're going to have an issue arguing that God would create a world like us or beings like us, right? So it's for the theist, like I kind of argue you can't really have it both ways. Either you got to kind of go with what I think is the right way of saying, look, no, we can think serious about these things and have broad expectations, including more expectations of what God would do. And we'll see that classical theism is extremely fruitful in its predictions, but then we better have a good story for the problem of evil, right?
Yeah.
Or you can go like skeptical theism,
right,
and like maybe not have to worry so much about the problem of evil or give like a defense or theodicy, but then like you better not be doing all the other stuff that we did about like why God would create a world, because like you've just put yourself in the dark, essentially, in terms of, you see what I'm saying? Like you can't be arbitrary about it, if that makes sense. So I go with the former. I think we can have expectations of God, and I have always loved the traditional insight. So it's I've always found this so beautiful, and I think beauty, other things equal, can be an indicator of truth, right? Following Norris Clark, right, that God's primary impulse to create is to share his goodness, right? And that God does want to unite all of creation to himself. However, not all things are capable of loving intimacy with God because they're unconscious. So what can God do? Well, God, if he's going to bring sort of the great chain of being into unity with himself as its ultimate end, he can create beings like us that are spiritual and material fusions, if you will, right? Okay. As a sort of apex of creation, right? That if like by bringing us into loving union with the Godhead, he's literally like pulling the entire universe, because we're made of like cosmic dust too, right?
Yeah.
Along for the ride. And I've always thought that that's not just a beautiful story, but if you do, and it's something that's shared among different traditions, right? It is in Christianity, and it gets into debates of whether the incarnation would have happened even without the fall and stuff like that. Skip all that for now, but it's there, right? And that definitely has always seemed right to me. However, there was a wrench thrown into the into plan A, if you will, but God permitted it because God does have plan B, right? And then this is where we kind of get into, and the theodicy I give in the book is Christian, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I argue that the kind of Christian commitments I use to wrestle and grapple with the problem of evil are probable consequences of classical theism, not internal complications. So I try to deal with the simplicity issue as well. And then there's two steps here, Michael, and we can go into as much detail as you want. This is a very big section of my book, but I can at least give the highlights. There's two steps to dealing now with the evidential problem of evil. Does the distribution of suffering and pain, I think we may have even talked about this a little bit on your show before, right, count as evidence for naturalism? Right? Does it? And there's two steps I take in the book. The first step is to challenge the claim that naturalism itself has a good explanation of suffering and pain. And I do that by going into naturalistic philosophy of mind. And I show that the qualitative dimension of experience is not something that is well explained or predicted by naturalism, particularly the felt aspects of pain. And we can get into reasons why. So what I do is I lower, and I think fairly so, the expectation that we would experience a world like ours if naturalism is true, that has this distribution of suffering. So I'm trying to take it away from the naturalist here, that they actually have a predictive score here. I'm saying this is way too quick. Once we get into the mechanics of naturalism and certain philosophies of mind, of how like we make sense of the qualitative dimension, the felt aspects of pain, there's really no good naturalistic story that's plausible here. So I'm trying to take away from the naturalist, right? And some theists, my friend Jim Madden does that. And he's got a paper in response to Paul Draper. And he actually thinks that's enough. He'll say, like, once you see that the naturalist, once you really investigate, does not have a good story for pain, the felt aspects of pain. Now, real quickly, why is that? Well, a lot of times naturalists assume, well, look, pain serves a biologically useful role in, avoiding bad situations and pleasure for procreating. But again, what you have to do is you have to go deeper and say, well, is that right? And various philosophers, including Jim Madden, say no, right? Because on the most plausible naturalistic philosophy of mind, of making sense of the mind-body relation, or the felt aspect, the qualitative dimension, and the physical dimension, veers towards epiphenomenalism in philosophy of mind. And an epiphenomena, for people who aren't familiar, is something that is caused, but itself causes nothing. It's sort of a residue that like floats atop its physical base with no causal influence, right? And if that's right, then the felt aspects of pain do not play a useful functional role, right? It's just the physics underneath that's doing it, such that we don't have any reason why that qualitative dimension is there, right? That even if it could emerge, and I argue earlier in the book that we don't have a good account of how even the felt aspect could emerge in naturalism, there's really no good reason of why it would emerge, because you don't need it to get the joints in the right place, if that makes sense, right? It's all the mindless physical interactions underneath that are being selected for by evolution and stuff like that. And then to kind of like close off certain loopholes, I say, like, even if you're not an epiphenomenalist in philosophy of mind, this is where things get pretty technical in the book, whether you're, take a strong reductionist view, like type or functionalist, I can run a similar argument for you, right? All to say is that I'm taking away what I think is one of the critical components of the evidential problem of evil is that naturalism does have a good explanation of suffering and pain. I say upon deeper and superficially, you might think that, but substantially, no, it doesn't, right? And then, like my buddy Jim will say, that's enough. Now if the theist just has any story, no matter how bad it is, at least some story is better than no story. But I told him to his face, I said, Jim, you're way too modest, man. I think we can give a good story for classical theism, right? But the story requires many different components, which we certainly don't have the time to defend all of them now. I try to support as many as I can and then deploy them in the book. But there are components concerning metaphysics of love, what love requires, which is the union of two independent free wills, libertarian freedom, which I argue is compatible with God's universal causality, that God does source our freedom, but he does not determine our choice. That's an important assumption. Again, that's something that's defended by thinkers like Matthews Grant. And then I use work from Eleanor Stump on the relation between grace and will, how God works on the will through formal causality, and that suffering really is the best or only available means to bring us to a point of acquiescence where God can insert the form of justification to begin the process of sanctification, right? So I give a Christian story there, right? Where suffering as the best or only available means, right, to bring us to, well, really first to escape the worst possible outcome, right? Which is eternal self-isolation, hell, right? Eternal self-separation from God, right? And there's a moral intuition there that we don't always think that it's permissible to do or permit something bad to get something good. Maybe it is sometimes for some people, but we kind of think that's questionable. However, we do often think that it's okay, maybe even requires sometimes to do or at least permit something bad in order to prevent something far worse, right? And so the story we give as Christians, and this is a little quibble I have in my book, the Christian story, I claim, is not a soul-building theodicy. It's not like God wills this world with all of its horrors, and there's many horrors, so that people can be brave and courage. I've always found that repugnant. It is a soul-saving and healing theodicy, right? That God allows a particular providence of suffering because it is the best or only available means for us to avoid the outcomes of what is otherwise a terminal spiritual cancer, right? That would result in hell, right? And then by avoiding that, we subsequently also get the best other thing, right? Because for Christianity, there's only those two outcomes, which is eternal union with God. But those are the seeds of the story that I develop, and there's many components along there, right? And of course, there's other things that I invite people to think about that often aren't thought about. That if you are a theist, and this comes to wider ontological commitments, but I don't think that they're a problem in terms of complexity costs because they're not at the root theory, but that like angels, demons, all this plays a role, right? If for traditional theists, creation is mediated through the archons, right? And some of them, we believe, and I think you can give an argument of why angelic sin is possible, have tried to screw things up, right? And this is also, and should play, and I wish Christians would take more seriously the role of other entities possessed of libertarian freedom and the role they play in this particular line of providence, including the providence of suffering. So I explore that a little bit. I say you don't need this to give the story I'm doing, but as a theist and certainly as a Christian, like this is part of our worldview, right? This is part of the story that helps make sense of the suffering and evil that we experience in this world. So there's a lot of different considerations there, but that's kind of like the hardly adequate 10,000 foot overview. So I'm happy to explore any of the further details you'd like.
Yeah. I want to make sure that I understood you at one point here. Did you indicate that one of the reasons why we have sin and evil in the world and even hell is because it's a good motivator for us to avoid it? Otherwise we wouldn't avoid it.
No, definitely not. It's not. No.
Okay. I misunderstood then. But can you clarify that part that where I maybe got confused on?
Yeah, no, definitely don't think it's just like some carrot and stick. I think hell, and I argue this again, there's a lot of metaphysics here. So let's take a few steps back, right?
Okay.
One is the possibility of failure and sin. And here you find this in Aquinas. Jacques Maritain develops it a lot. And the idea is this, like if God's going to go for love, and we think this is what God is ultimately going for. If he's taking a risk on anything, it's just love, right? With other beings like us, it's going to require he brings about beings that have wills, right?
Sure, of course.
That to me, that's just a duh, right?
Of course.
However, Aquinas, Maritain, and many others argue there's unfortunately there's a necessary metaphysical risk here.
Yeah.
We are not the good as such. Only God is. Our will is not naturally impeccable, right? We can either choose to consider the moral rule in particular judgments, the good as such, or we can, to use a term by philosopher Mark Johnson, self-valorize, choose our own perceived welfare interests over the good as such. We can fail, we can sin, right? And I think Aquinas is right on this. I think Maritain is great on this, that it's just a necessary metaphysical possibility, right? That if God is going to bring about angels, humans, anything else that has a will that is not God, that is naturally impeccable, it could fail.
Sure.
It could fail, right?
Yeah.
And it could fail so significantly that it just eternally separates itself from God. Now, that is an objective failure. Giving the value scale of Christianity, if something chooses that, it has reached really like the worst possible state, right? But that is a sort of inherent risk. And then you can ask yourself seriously, like, is that risk worth it? Is love worth the risk? And I think if there's anything, we survey the range of goods of anything that's worth the risk, it's got to be that, right? It's got to be that. Now, of course, God's not going to take that risk unreasonably. Whatever God's reasons are and whatever they encompass, he would only take that risk if he thinks that it's reasonable to do so, right? And actually, I think this helps to explain contingency, right? Because the reasons for creation might not have been overwhelming. Like, God probably had good reasons not to create and just stay within himself. And what would the good reason not to create be? Well, sin, right?
Yeah.
But by God's will, he chose to create when he could not have. So I actually think that actually helps to show another reason why, contingency is there, right? It really could have been otherwise. There were not decisive reasons, if you will, right? But there were still adequate reasons, right, for God to create and to justify, right? Now, God doesn't just, certainly as Christians, we don't think that he just, was like, oh, well, they messed up. That's the end of it. No, God launches that rescue plan. He launches that plan B because he loves us so much, right? And he wants to do everything he can that respects our nature as finite metaphysical creatures. God can do miracles here and there, but this is another expectation of God. Maritain's big on this. On the general run, God's not just going to miraculously intervene all the time. Why? Because then creation would be nonsense. We wouldn't have that stable, orderly system that we need for meaningful development and interaction and to actually be the sorts of things that we are. And God doesn't engage in nonsense. So whatever miracles are, they have to be the exception, not the rule, right? And so then you have the Christian story kick in there, right? That God has not just, resigned the project to failure, but of course, sent his only begotten son. And, all your readers are familiar with the rest and then you have the theory of the atonement, right? And the line of suffering is the best or only available means to try and bring us. And this is, I think, the best interpretation of Aquinas' theory of atonement. If people want I think the most beautiful work on this would be Eleanor Stump's. Start with her Wandering in Darkness, go to her book Atonement, and then finish with her more recent one, Image of God. If you want all the sort of fine details of this, of which I take some and try to summarize in my book. Her books are much more substantial on this. And I think that can give you an adequate explanation, indeed, even a certain prediction of the world that we see, including with its horrors. Now, there's a few other things I consider and throw in there. I bring in considerations from like Peter van Inwagen, and he's got a lot of important stuff to say on the problem of evil and issues concerning arbitrariness that are kind of technical, but I think help to deal with borderline cases and stuff like that. So there's other components I explore in the book, and I'll just say that I try to be very careful with this because it's a subject that requires a lot of care because it's something we all struggle with, something I struggled with, right? We all struggle with it, right? So it's not like I'm just like writing this as an apologetic, hey, believe this. No, I, like everybody else, has to work this out for myself.
Sure.
And in doing so, I believe that there is incredible spiritual fruit in that, because in thinking through this issue very painfully and deeply, because we all suffer in life, right? Immensely. And trying to come from with as much clarity as I can on what I believe we can know about God and the nature of love and God's love, and putting aside what I think are very bad theodicies, almost cruel and callous theodicies, you find this, I think you can find this very beautiful, this very hopeful, this very inspiring and very comforting picture. I may not have been able to adequately present that now, but I think that is what you can come to when you really think through these issues slowly, carefully, and with adequate patience.
Yeah, that's helpful. It takes away a lot of the force behind the naturalists and their use of moral evil and sin in the world and pain and suffering and things like that.
Yeah.
It takes away the force of it when you put it in that perspective.
Yeah, and not only do I think at the end of the day that you can reverse the evidential problem of evil. And I always hate when people say read the book for this, but this is there's so much here. It's really hard to summarize.
Of course,
but at the very least, right? If we're just backing up, we're just in worldview comparison again, right? The theist could say, you know what? Fine, counts as some evidence for naturalism, but the scales are still like this in favor of theism. Right now, I don't think that's the right move. I don't think you need to make that concession. But, in certain things, you can certainly say like, oh, yeah, your theory better accounts for this than mine. But in light of our total understanding, we should still go with this theory. Right.
But even though in reality, their theory actually doesn't account for it.
I argue it doesn't. Right.
But even if it did, it still doesn't. It's like maybe they have 2 points there, but we have 10 points elsewhere.
Yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's true. But I do think emotionally, not that you take this perspective, but those who would try to sidestep it and say, kind of, I guess like Davies,
Brian
you
Davis,
mentioned
right?
Brian Davis. I think you were indicating that he would maybe just try to sidestep it and say, but we already know God exists and we know that there's suffering in the world. There has to be an explanation. I just don't think that most people will find that satisfying.
No,
they're going to want an answer,
man. And like, here's the thing: like, if God is going to let me suffer, and boy, He has, right? And I know that goes for all of us. Like, it has to be for a good reason, right?
Yeah.
And like, maybe I won't see the particular reason every time. And in fact, I have reasons to think I won't see every particular reason, right? Okay. Yeah. But I feel like I should be able to see the broad reasons, right?
Sure.
And I argue that you can. And look, I think there's many instances in my life where at least I didn't see the particular reason at the time, but I can look back.
And now you see it.
And now I see like, God knew what He was doing.
Yeah.
Right. And that has taught me great patience and also great humility. Right. There are many, I won't get into it now because I'm not a person. If anyone wants to talk about it, you certainly can. But like, we've all been there. Right.
Sure.
Like, God, why is this happening to me? Right. It's like awful stuff. Yeah. And like, it might not be till like 6 or 7 years later. Right. That you finally think you gain some clarity on what that was for. Right. Because here's the thing, God sees everything all at once. Right. Our vision is very, very, very small. So like the thing that certain skeptical theists do get right is that like we shouldn't even expect to see the particulars or all the reasons. Right. Sometimes an analogy, I think Alston uses this analogy. He's pretty good on this. He's like, look, say you're a neophyte in chess, right? Mm-hmm. And you're against a chess master. Are you going to see the reason for any particular move that the chess master makes? You might think that there's no reason at all, but like, that's not surprising because you don't know squat about chess, right?
Right.
But if you know this guy's a chess master, like you can be pretty confident there's some good reasons for the moves he's making. Of
course.
And then of course you can you swap the relevant things around. The distance between a neophyte and a chess master is nothing compared to us and God.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you can start to see, okay, yeah, maybe I'm not totally in the dark, but I should have a certain humility about all this. Right. Mm-hmm.
That's very helpful. Yeah, because I kind of feel like that's where most people are probably at in these discussions of philosophy, is just how to account for evil and suffering in the world, because that's what our experience is. All of us experience that pain and suffering. And so that's probably the most burning question that we all have that has to be addressed if we're going to believe that God is good and that God exists.
Yeah, and I believe that the ultimate answer is the religious one. At the end of the day, I don't think philosophy gets you all the way through on this.
Yeah, but it helps you get to the point of religion and divine revelation. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's that first step, certainly.
Right. It makes it rationally credible. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm so excited about your book. Congratulations on publishing this, and wish you all the best for it. Any parting words that you wanted to sneak in here that maybe we didn't get into?
Yeah, boy. Well, just that it's always a joy to talk with you. I always have so much fun here, and we explored often so much territory, and I every time I'm like, oh man, I just wish we had like 3 more hours to go at it, because these are big topics, right? And you can only really scratch the surface. And if people enjoyed what we said here, I would, love it if they checked out the book. You can find it at the usual places, of course, and it covers a lot of territory. And if nothing else, even if you're not like really into philosophy, I think it in many ways can serve as a good introduction, because we get into some deep water at times, but I do try to. I don't assume that people are deeply familiar with these issues or debates, and I try to start in I've heard the analogy, sometimes you start in the kiddie pool, and then I try to really get you competent so we can be swimming in the deep end too, right?
It's the best of both worlds. You don't want to keep people in the kiddie pool, but you also don't want to just toss them in, in the deep section.
Yeah,
that's kind of where that's how, I that's what I appreciate. People who start me out in the kiddie pool, but then you take me into the deep part. And that's what I appreciate about this book, because there's a lot of clarity in it. It's written in a way that I can open it up and I can follow along and understand. And I'm certainly no expert in philosophy, so.
Oh, don't sell yourself short, my friend. I love what you're doing, and always learn a lot. And look, I'm no theologian, man, so I try to you'll see I minimum effective theology in my book, right? Just very careful there. But no, it's a joy, and we'll have to have you on my show again.
Oh, I'd love to do it, and love to have you back on the show. But yeah, congrats on the book. Everybody go and check it out. The Best Argument for God. I'll put a link to it there in the show notes with Sophia Institute Press. Once again, thank you so much for coming on, Pat. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, y'all take care. God bless.